Friday, January 6th, we discussed communication, primarily in relation to different approaches to working in groups. I asked you to define communication and to define approaches to group work, and then to create analogies to help explain those approaches. We also quickly addressed what an analogy is and how it might be used rhetorically. What we did not talk about is what rhetoric is, or the definitions of communication. So in these slides, I will discuss rhetoric, communication, and language, as well as what makes an analogy a form of rhetoric. The art of rhetoric is, put simply, in the words of, well, not the exact words, but by Greek philosopher Aristotle. He defines the art of rhetoric as a faculty of finding the available means of persuasion. So that means learning the best possible tools people might use to convince an audience that what they are saying makes sense or is worth considering. Some argue that rhetoric is a part of all communication. Even in your applications, you wrote essays that were essentially, as one student wrote, a sales pitch. In this class, we will operate on the premise that any communication is an attempt to get the audience to understand, respond, agree, or acknowledge what you have said or written. And so all forms of communication apply aspects of the art of rhetoric. So before we delve into communication, I think we need to talk about language. And language is a distinctly human activity, and this is a linguistics-based definition, that aids in the transmission of feelings and thoughts from one person to another. It is how we express what we think or feel through sounds or symbols, spoken or written, signs, posture, and gestures that convey certain meaning. Below are the primary differences between language and communication. Note the relationship between the two regardless of differences, and we'll get into the actual definition of communication in the next slide. But note that language is a system of communication that relies on verbal or nonverbal codes to transfer information, whereas communication is the way of interchanging messages or information between two or more people, focusing on the message. Language is a tool of communication. Communication is a process of transferring messages. Language changes dynamically as new words can be created, and communication is considered static as its basic steps remain unchanged. So there's a system to communication, and it pretty much stays the same. The basics of communication do not change. However, new words are added to the dictionary of language almost daily. And this is the source from which I received this information. Communication, linguistic communication involves applying rules that allow people to understand one another, even when they do not share the same world vision. So meaning is attributed to words through a convention that becomes established over time and within a given community, culture, whatnot. And this is the source of that definition. Communication is described as an act of interchanging ideas, information, or messages from one person or place to another via words or signs which are understood to both parties. It's a crucial activity for any group of beings because it is the means by which members of the group cooperate together. And we talked about cooperation, but it's also a means by which they coordinate or collaborate. So this is significant, and we'll get at it more as we go through the process of learning to write. But a message is encoded, then sent from one individual, the sender, to another, the receiver, through a channel. And sometimes I refer to that as a mode. So like your essay or a video or this PowerPoint. That message is then decoded and given feedback if communicated effectively. And the feedback is the exchange of communication. So I give information and you respond to that information. And this again is the source of this information. Okay, so communication awareness. So the point of doing this is to think about audience. And when you communicate, if you're going to do it effectively, you kind of need to understand who your audience is. So ways that you can think about that is to be aware of your own personal norms, such as how you greet people and how you enter conversations, the volume or tone of your voice, how you address differences in opinion, and how you broach or receive potentially sensitive comments. So if I'm in middle of thought and I come into a classroom and I just start talking to you about my thought, you might think that I'm rude if I don't greet you by saying hello or good morning or whatever it is your norm is. And that may not be my norm. And so then there right at the beginning, we might have a miscommunication, or there might be a lapse in our ability to communicate because we aren't operating on the same norm. So understanding your own norms might help you to identify the norms of others and maybe be more forgiving of their differences, and you can then try to address those differences so that you can meet somewhere in the middle. Language use is another thing about which you should be aware of. Do you share the same definition of words or ideas? For example, what is respect and what does it look like or sound like? What does it mean to be polite? Do you use the same slang language, and does it mean the same thing? There's an example that's given to me, something to do with the military and going into, I think, Iraq a long time ago. A guy was given a thumbs up, or saw somebody giving them a thumb, the soldiers giving, they were soldiers, they were looking at the audience gave them a thumbs up, and they thought that meant, yay, this is great, glad to see you here, but really it was the equivalent of being flipped off. So that's an example of misunderstanding gestures. So you want to make sure that whatever your language is, whether it's a gesture or words, that you guys are speaking the same language. Lived experience may be different. So what your norms are, sort of like generational differences, which we've already noticed that I have with my students, geographical differences, people from California versus people from South Dakota versus people from New York City. They all have different norms in the way their lives function. And cultural differences, which I'm pretty sure you guys could identify. Being aware of these things will help you to better communicate with people. So in thinking about all of this, I'm wondering, how might you use different approaches to group work and your understanding of communication in a writing class to help you improve your writing? And as you will see, that we will do a lot of speaking and writing and collaborating, and in order to understand all of these means of persuasion. The last thing in this presentation is the analogy, and here is the definition of analogy. It's a comparison between two things, typically for the purpose of explanation or clarification. It's an extension of a metaphor or simile, but if it's going to be used as a rhetorical device, then you have to make sure that the purpose of it is furthering a line of reasoning or drawing an inference or a form of reasoning employing comparative or parallel cases. So it has, you don't just give it just to give it, but it has a particular purpose, and pretty much any analogy has the purpose of extending understanding or to making a point. So that goes back to the idea that rhetoric is pretty much in everything that we do. But if you just give an analogy and there's no point to it, then I suppose it wouldn't be rhetorical. And here's the resource for that. All right, so hopefully this was helpful, and we will talk more about rhetoric and communication on Monday.